In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad in January 1943, a German soldier wrote his final letter home. "We fought for weeks over a single building. We captured the kitchen, but the Russians held the bedroom. We fought for every floor, every staircase, every wall. The city is hell. The streets are corpses and rubble. We are dying of cold and hunger. Tell my family I died for Germany." He died 2 days later. His letter was never sent. This was Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in human history. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought for control of one industrial city on the Volga River. Over 2 million soldiers fought in the battle. More than 1.8 million became casualties. More Soviet soldiers died in the 5-month battle than Americans in the entire war. The Germans lost 300,000 men, and of the 91,000 who finally surrendered, only 6,000 ever returned home. This is the story of Stalingrad, the battle that turned the tide of World War II. The battle where Hitler's unstoppable Wehrmacht met an immovable Soviet defense and broke itself to pieces. The battle that proved the Germans could be defeated. The turning point of the war. In the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. Since launching Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Hitler's armies had conquered vast territories across the Soviet Union. They'd pushed to the gates of Moscow. They'd besieged Leningrad. They'd captured millions of Soviet soldiers. Though the attack on Moscow had failed and been pushed back in the winter of 1941 and 1942, the Wehrmacht remained a formidable force. Hitler was convinced that one more major offensive would break the Soviet Union completely. For the 1942 summer campaign, Hitler chose the south. Operation Blue would drive into the Caucasus to capture the vital Soviet oil fields. Control those oil fields and the Soviet war machine would grind to a halt. The German tanks and planes needed fuel. Capturing Soviet oil would solve Germany's supply problems while simultaneously crippling the enemy. But Hitler couldn't resist adding one more objective: the city of Stalingrad. It was a major industrial center producing tanks, weapons, and ammunition. It sat on the Volga River, a crucial transportation route. And most importantly, it bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, Hitler's greatest enemy. Capturing Stalingrad would be both a strategic and propaganda victory of immense value. So Hitler split his forces. Army Group A drove south toward the Caucasus. Army Group B, including General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, drove east toward Stalingrad. Military strategists would later identify this as Hitler's first major mistake. Dividing forces between two objectives weakened both efforts. But Hitler was confident. The city would fall within weeks. Then the real prize, the oil fields, would be taken. Stalingrad in 1942 was a city of about 900,000 people. It stretched for nearly 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River. Factories filled the northern industrial district. Residential areas spread through the center. The Mamayev Kurgan, a large hill in the middle of the city, dominated the landscape. Whoever controlled that hill could observe and fire upon the entire city. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched a massive aerial bombardment of Stalingrad. Over 600 aircraft dropped bombs continuously. The city burned. Wooden buildings were consumed by fire. Brick and concrete structures collapsed into rubble. Civilians died by the thousands. Some estimates suggest 40,000 civilians were killed in the first weeks of the battle. The city that the Germans were trying to capture was being systematically destroyed. But the destruction actually helped the Soviets. A city in ruins is easier to defend than one with intact buildings. Rubble creates natural obstacles and defensive positions. Collapsed buildings become fortresses. The Germans, trained for open battlefield maneuver warfare, were now being forced into urban combat. Street by street, building by building, room by room. The kind of close-quarters fighting where superior tactics and equipment mattered less and sheer determination mattered more. The Soviet defense was commanded by General Vasily Chukov, a tough 42-year-old veteran. When he took command of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad on September 12, he issued a stark order. "We will defend the city or die in the attempt. There is no land for us beyond the Volga." The Volga River was at their backs. There was nowhere to retreat. They would hold Stalingrad or die trying. Chukov developed tactics specifically for urban warfare. Keep close to the enemy. Hug them. German air superiority and artillery advantage meant nothing if Soviet and German forces were intermingled in the same buildings. The Germans couldn't bomb or shell positions without hitting their own troops. So Soviet soldiers deliberately fought at extremely close range. Sometimes German troops occupied one floor of a building while Soviets held the floor above or below. The fighting was savage beyond description. Entire battles were fought over single buildings. Pavlov's house became one of the most famous. A platoon of Soviet soldiers, led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, fortified a 4-story apartment building and held it for 58 days against constant German attacks. The building changed hands repeatedly. The Soviets would defend to the last man, be overrun, then counterattack and retake it. Both sides suffered massive casualties for control of a single apartment building. The grain elevator was another critical battle. German and Soviet forces fought for this massive concrete structure for days. Combat took place in complete darkness inside the elevator. Soldiers fought with knives, bayonets, and grenades in pitch-black corridors filled with grain dust that choked lungs and reduced visibility to zero. Men died without ever seeing who killed them. The Germans pushed the Soviets back block by block, building by building. By November, the Germans controlled about 90% of the city. The Soviets clung to narrow strips of land along the Volga, their backs literally to the river. Supply lines crossed the Volga under constant German fire. Boats bringing ammunition and reinforcements were sunk daily. Wounded being evacuated drowned. But the supplies kept coming, and the Soviets kept fighting. The conditions were hellish. November brought winter. Temperatures dropped below zero. Soldiers froze to death at their positions. Frostbite claimed thousands. Food ran short. The Germans, expecting a quick victory, hadn't prepared for extended urban combat in winter conditions. Soviet soldiers, more accustomed to the cold, still suffered terribly. Both armies were being ground down by combat and climate. Soldiers on both sides later described Stalingrad as worse than anything they'd experienced. A German soldier wrote, "Stalingrad is no longer a city. By day it is a cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. When night arrives, dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to the other bank. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." The hand-to-hand combat was brutal. When ammunition ran out, soldiers fought with entrenching tools, essentially shovels sharpened into makeshift axes. Gunther Schroeder, a German soldier, recalled, "When the Russians suddenly charged in, we could do only one thing: pull out our spades and strike at them from below and hit the main artery below the head." This wasn't warfare as most soldiers understood it. This was survival. Kill or be killed in the most primitive, visceral way imaginable. While the Germans focused on Stalingrad, Soviet commanders were planning something audacious. General Georgy Zhukov, the brilliant Soviet military strategist, had been assembling massive forces north and south of the city. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, 14,000 artillery pieces, 1,400 tanks. The Germans knew Soviet forces were gathering but believed they were preparing a frontal assault to relieve Stalingrad. They were wrong. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement. Soviet forces attacked from the north and south, deliberately targeting the Romanian and Italian forces guarding the German flanks. These Allied forces were poorly equipped and less motivated than German troops. They collapsed within days. On November 23, the two Soviet pincers met at Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The trap snapped shut. The entire German Sixth Army, about 300,000 soldiers, was now surrounded inside Stalingrad. General Paulus immediately requested permission to break out of the encirclement. A fighting retreat while they still had strength and supplies. But Hitler refused. The Sixth Army will hold its positions. No retreat. Hitler was convinced the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe managed barely 100 tons per day on average. And even that came at terrible cost as Soviet fighters shot down German transport planes by the dozens. The trapped Germans began starving. By December, soldiers were on quarter rations. Then eighth rations. Men weakened from hunger became vulnerable to disease and frostbite. Thousands died daily not from combat but from cold, hunger, and illness. The wounded had no hope of evacuation. They lay in makeshift hospitals in cellars and ruins, freezing, starving, dying slowly. A relief attempt was made. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein assembled forces for Operation Winterstorm, an attempt to break through to the encircled Sixth Army. The attack got within 30 miles of Stalingrad before being stopped by fierce Soviet resistance. Paulus was ordered to break out and link up with Manstein. But by then, the Sixth Army was too weak. They lacked the fuel, ammunition, and physical strength for a breakout attempt. The relief effort failed. The Sixth Army was doomed. Throughout December and January, the Soviets tightened the noose. They attacked constantly, compressing the German pocket smaller and smaller. The Germans defended desperately but were being worn down. By late January, the Sixth Army had been split into two pockets, northern and southern. Communication between them was lost. Each group fought on in isolation, knowing death or captivity was inevitable. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered in history. Hitler was essentially telling Paulus to commit suicide rather than be captured. The next day, January 31st, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. On February 2nd, the northern pocket also surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 300,000 German and Axis soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, about 235,000 were captured. The rest had died of combat, cold, or starvation. Of those captured, only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest died in Soviet prisoner of war camps from disease, malnutrition, and harsh treatment. The Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, had been completely destroyed. Soviet casualties were even higher. About 750,000 Soviet soldiers died in the Battle of Stalingrad. Nearly 500,000 during the defense of the city. Another 250,000 during the encirclement and destruction of the Sixth Army. Add the civilian deaths and the toll approaches 1 million Soviet citizens. The city itself was utterly destroyed. Of the 900,000 pre-war population, only about 10,000 remained when the battle ended. The vast majority had been evacuated, fled, or died. Those who survived had endured 5 months in a literal hell on earth. The impact of Stalingrad on World War II cannot be overstated. It was the psychological turning point of the war. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Wehrmacht could be beaten. Soviet morale soared. German morale plummeted. In Germany, the Nazi propaganda machine had to acknowledge defeat for the first time. Joseph Goebbels declared a period of national mourning. The German people began to understand that the war might not end in victory. More importantly, Stalingrad was a strategic disaster for Germany. The loss of the Sixth Army, an entire field army, left a massive gap on the Eastern Front. Germany had to pull forces from other areas to plug the hole. The Caucasus offensive was abandoned. The oil fields Hitler had coveted remained in Soviet hands. And the Soviet Union, which had seemed on the brink of collapse just months earlier, had demonstrated it could not only survive but strike back with devastating effect. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviets. The Germans would launch one more major offensive, at Kursk in July 1943, but it failed. From then on, the Soviets advanced steadily westward. They would not stop until they reached Berlin. Stalingrad also had a profound effect on Soviet identity. The battle became the defining moment of what the Soviets called the Great Patriotic War. The sacrifice and heroism of the defenders were celebrated endlessly in Soviet propaganda. In 1945, Stalingrad was proclaimed a hero city. In 1961, the city was renamed Volgograd as part of de-Stalinization, though the battle remains known as Stalingrad. A massive memorial complex was built on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that had been so fiercely contested. The centerpiece is the Motherland Calls, a towering 279-foot statue of a woman holding a sword aloft, calling her sons to defend the motherland. It's one of the tallest statues in the world. The memorial site contains the remains of over 35,000 Soviet soldiers. It became a pilgrimage site for Russians honoring the sacrifice of those who fought there. For the German survivors, Stalingrad became a symbol of suffering and betrayal. They'd been ordered to hold an impossible position by a leader who refused to acknowledge reality. Hitler's refusal to allow retreat had condemned the Sixth Army to destruction. Many German generals lost faith in Hitler's leadership after Stalingrad. Some would eventually participate in the July 1944 plot to assassinate him. The battle has been studied by military historians worldwide as an example of urban warfare at its most brutal. The tactics developed at Stalingrad, particularly the Soviet embrace of close quarters fighting to negate enemy advantages in artillery and air power, influenced urban warfare doctrine for decades. Every military that has fought in cities since, from Berlin to Hue to Fallujah to Mariupol, has studied Stalingrad. Stalingrad also demonstrates the human cost of ideological warfare. Hitler ordered the attack on Stalingrad partly for its symbolic value. Capturing the city named after Stalin became an obsession. Stalin, in turn, ordered the city defended at all costs for the same reason. It bore his name. Losing it was unthinkable. Both dictators sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives for symbolism and pride. The soldiers and civilians caught between them paid the price. The battle produced countless stories of individual courage and suffering. Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper, became famous for his duel with a German sniper during the battle. The story was later dramatized in the film Enemy at the Gates. Whether the duel happened exactly as described is debated, but Zaitsev did kill over 200 German soldiers as a sniper at Stalingrad and became a hero of the Soviet Union. Pavlov's house, that apartment building defended for 58 days, became legendary. The defenders were from multiple Soviet republics: Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Jews. They represented the multi-ethnic nature of the Soviet Union and became symbols of Soviet unity against fascism. Sergeant Pavlov survived the war and the building still stands today, preserved as a memorial. The grain elevator battle produced stories of soldiers fighting in complete darkness, disoriented, terrified, killing anyone they encountered because they couldn't tell friend from foe. Some soldiers went mad from the stress. Others displayed incredible calm under impossible conditions. The psychological toll of Stalingrad affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Civilian survivors told harrowing stories. Children hiding in cellars for months. Women carrying water from the Volga under fire. Families burned out of their homes multiple times, moving from ruin to ruin seeking shelter. And after the battle, when Soviet authorities conducted a census, they found about 10,000 civilians still alive in the ruins. Among them were 994 children. Only 9 were reunited with their parents. The rest went to state orphanages, traumatized by months of living in hell. Stalingrad represents the absolute extreme of industrial warfare. 2 modern armies, equipped with the most destructive weapons available, fighting without mercy or restraint in an urban environment. The result was carnage on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Nearly 2 million casualties. A city obliterated. Suffering that survivors struggled to describe because normal language seemed inadequate. But Stalingrad also represents human resilience. The Soviet defenders who refused to give up despite being pushed to the very edge of the Volga. The German soldiers who kept fighting even after they knew they were doomed. The civilians who survived months of bombardment and starvation. The ability of human beings to endure conditions that seem impossible. Today, Volgograd is a thriving city of over 1 million people. It's been completely rebuilt. Only fragments remain of the battle. Preserved ruins. Museums. Memorials. The vast memorial complex on Mamayev Kurgan, where thousands gather every year on Victory Day, May 9th, to honor those who fought and died. But the memory of Stalingrad lives on. In Russia, it remains the defining moment of national pride and sacrifice. In Germany, a reminder of the cost of following a mad dictator. And worldwide, recognized as one of the pivotal battles of the 20th century. The battle that turned the tide of World War II. The battle where Hitler's dream of conquest broke against Soviet determination. The bloodiest battle in human history.